Welcome to Global Landscapes Forum 2019 here in Accra, in Ghana, where we are discussing restoring Africa's landscapes from the ground up. And this afternoon, I have the pleasure of speaking with George Schoneveld, who's a senior scientist working with C4 since 2008. He has led several large research projects in Africa, Latin America, and Southeast Asia, largely focused on social, economic, and environmental impacts and governance of private agricultural and forestry investment models. He's widely published on this topic in leading academic journals and is currently the coordinator for the CGIAR Forest, Trees, and Agroforestry FTA Research Programs Cluster on Inclusive Business and Finance. I got it?
That was completely correct. And thanks so much for hosting me today.
Thank you for joining us. We appreciate it. So what we understand is that C4 just launched here at the GLF a new project to test the jurisdictional approach to sustainable landscapes in eastern Ghana. Please tell us more about that.
That's right. This project is called GML, Governing Multifunctional Landscapes. It's an initiative that's funded by the European Commission, specifically the Directorate General of International Cooperation and Development. It started about a year ago, and we're now focusing very much on Ghana. The point of the project is very much to pilot and to validate how jurisdictional approaches can work in Africa. There's not a lot of experience on jurisdictional approaches, so we're really trying to figure out how can a jurisdictional approach work. So our focus is very much on seeing how can we de-link agricultural production from deforestation.
Okay.
And the project is essentially based on three pillars.
Okay.
So we're looking on the one hand at, okay, how can we promote sustainable intensification? How can we protect the forest and restore the forest? And how can we develop agricultural value chains? So the sustainable intensification part is looking at how can smallholders overcome barriers to adopting better practices? So climate smart agriculture practices, for example, and what sort of business and service delivery models do we need to provide those services in a way that is durable and actually improves practices on the ground.
Okay, wow.
Then the forest protection part is looking more at land use planning. So we're piloting different sorts of participatory land use planning initiatives, and at the same time trying to explore how can we improve existing monitoring and enforcement systems. So what sort of capacities do we need to build? And what sort of innovations are out there right now to improve forest monitoring?
Okay.
So we're trying to test those sort of technologies and bring them to scale. And then thirdly, it was the value chain development, is about how can we improve linkages between agribusiness and smallholders. At the moment, there's not a lot of service provision. Smallholders struggle to participate in these sorts of markets. So we're trying to examine, along with the private sector in a participatory way, what sort of models could work to bring smallholders on board and provide the benefits of accessing these sort of international markets.
Okay, well, interesting. And for those of us who are not, well learned in this area, what does a jurisdictional approach mean? Like, if you, in layman's terms, for
a jurisdictional approach is essentially like a landscape approach.
Okay, okay.
So it's a variation of landscape approach. Okay. So I think there are a couple of differences between the two.
Okay.
So a jurisdictional approach very much focuses on a jurisdiction. So it looks at a political unit, a smaller level political unit, which can be a district. The landscape approach will look at a socio-ecological system, which can transcend jurisdictional boundaries. So by virtue of it being very focused on a jurisdiction, it also means that it's often very government-led.
Okay.
So these are often government-led initiatives with some sort of neutral intervention. And the genesis of these jurisdictional approaches very much came from the REDD+ and zero deforestation movement.
Okay.
So global pressures to try to reduce deforestation from agricultural production. And it's much easier to work with jurisdictions where you have accountable parties and governments, for example, than work in a landscape which doesn't have very clear boundaries. So for those purposes, you saw jurisdictional approaches emerge.
Right.
But the general principles are the same as a landscape approach. So they try to transcend sectoral silos. They try to adopt an integrated multidisciplinary approach. And they really try to find solutions for addressing competing land uses.
Okay.
So on the one hand, you have land uses, for example, land use objectives on food security. You have them on economic development and cash crop production, industrial development, environmental protection. And there are a lot of trade-offs between these. So both these approaches try to find solutions to these issues. And that is very much centered around a multi-stakeholder dialogue.
Okay.
Saying, okay, we have to bring different stakeholders together in an equitable way, is bring stakeholders that usually don't participate in planning processes to undertake a collaborative planning initiative.
Okay.
So that's inclusive, there's buy-in, and it also corresponds with the needs and interests of specific groups on the ground. So we're talking about, women, youth, other marginalized groups that rarely feature in policy development discussions.
Right. And then I guess it's easier also to measure progress when it's more focused on a jurisdictional.
It's easier to measure progress, and I think especially from the zero deforestation movement, because if you have a larger company, say in Europe somewhere, and you want to source somewhere, you can say, okay, if I source in District A, then I can be sure that it's deforestation free. So it makes it much easier because they engage with the whole jurisdiction instead of one supplier.
Right.
And another benefit is that in a jurisdictional approach, you can also embed it in public sector budget and planning cycles.
Right.
So make this part of existing policy processes.
Okay.
So in that way, it really tries to build on what's already there and the authorities on the ground, and tries to resolve the inefficiencies that we still see today.
Okay, very interesting. So why have you decided to base this project here in Ghana in particular, in the Atiwa landscape, I understand?
I mean, Ghana is a fascinating country, and we had the luxury of spending an entire year working across 6 different countries to try to find the ideal area where to work. And we eventually settled on Ghana with the endorsement of the European Commission. Because the landscape where we're working, which is what we call the Atiwa landscape, this is in eastern Ghana. It covers 2 jurisdictions, so it's Kwebibirim and Atiwa West.
Okay.
And they have an extremely important ecological area. So we have the Atiwa Forest Range Reserves, which is one of the global biodiversity hotspots, but it also provides water to over 5 million people in Ghana.
Wow.
So this is from a biological perspective is an extremely important area, but at the same time it's also a very commodified area. So we have a lot of oil palm production, there's rubber production, there's cocoa, there's citrus, there's a lot of mining moving in. So as you can imagine, there's a lot of pressure on the land from different sectors, and this is putting a lot of pressure on existing land, but it's also causing an extensification.
Right.
So you have smallholders which are moving into forest reserve areas, and so there's a lot of potential, since yields and smallholders are fairly unproductive, to try to intensify their production and really alleviate the pressure on these precious forest resources. So in that respect, it's a fascinating landscape with a lot of private sector organizations, which are also very committed to making the sector their sector sustainable, but also recognizes the sustainability of their investment also hinges on enhancing efficiency and actually managing the natural resource base well.
Okay, wow, very interesting. So how does this approach reconcile economic development and forest conservation?
How can it reconcile? See, that's the question. But I mean, that's obviously, it's difficult for us to say up front how we're going to do that.
Right.
Because the purpose of the project is to work with stakeholders to identify locally appropriate, viable pathways and to actually test those pathways and say, okay, this is how people think we can resolve these problems. The role of C4 is then very much to see, okay, is this viable? Is this feasible? But the premise is, of course, that we have to try to monetize any efforts that contribute to conservation. And then, there are, of course, opportunities in carbon markets, but they also have to come intrinsically to the extent that if you're promoting sustainable intensification, farmers may need to invest more resources, need to invest more labor, but they need to see returns in terms of increasing yields, increasing prices, improved access to premium markets. So these are all challenges we have ahead, and we're trying to conduct the research to find out how that can be done. But it appears that there's a lot of opportunity for a win-win-win.
Okay, great.
It might sound very ambitious, but I think we can manage, and there's a huge commitment from the stakeholders to work towards that goal.
Great. And what's the timeline for this? Is there a timeline or?
So at the moment, we've been doing our stakeholder engagements over the last 12 months.
Okay.
So we've drafted a work plan and priorities. We're inaugurating the platform in a few months. Mm-hmm. And then our timeline is to work through with the platform to develop an integrated landscape strategy. Mm-hmm. And then spend the second year, that'll be 2021, looking at how to operationalize this.
Okay.
And what sort of funding do we need? Is there a business case? Is it feasible? Are the assumptions that underpin the strategy, can we deliver on those assumptions? So that's something that the second year will bring us, and then hopefully CIFOR phases out. And we've helped capacitate the stakeholders to move this forward, and also prepare them for generating funding to support this compelling initiative.
Oh, fantastic. Well, I think that's great. I think we've covered everything that we're supposed to, unless there's anything you want to add that you think we haven't covered. Yeah, we're good, right?
Yeah.
Thank you for your time. Really appreciate it. Thank you.